Okay, so our second theoretical look at young adults comes to us from a guy named Arthur Chickering. Chickering's been around for a long time. He's one of the kind of the premier pioneering researchers in dealing with college students in particular and young adults in general. And Chickering came up with a thing that he called 7 developmental vectors. He came out with this quite a while back. Um, and he has a really good book. You can see the reference there called Education and Identity, that I think is a really good reference for what happens to people during college and young adulthood. And Chickering said that what happens in college is these 7 developmental vectors occur, and he calls them vectors because the notion of a vector is that it has direction and power, that it has some force, but that force is moving in a particular direction. And so he believed that this is pushing young adults toward becoming um, adults, actually moving out of adolescence into adulthood. So he says the first thing that happens is that we develop competence. That as adolescents we have some level of competence, of course, but as we move into young adulthood and college, one of the things that we tend to do is find out a little bit more about what we're good at doing, what we can accomplish, what we're not so good at. This has something to do with our choosing college majors, thinking about career opportunities and all those sorts of things. Try to kind of get a grip on what we're good at and what we may be able to do in the future, understanding our level of competence. Second thing that we do is we learn as young adults to manage emotions. Adolescence is a time of what the Germans called Sturm und Drang, this storm and stress, lots of upheaval, lots of emotional turmoil, lots of crying and getting mad and yelling at your parents and all kinds of stuff, breaking up with the girlfriends and boyfriends, and it's just all of that stuff about trying to figure out who we are and have relationships. And Chickering says in young adulthood, one of the things that happens is we begin to develop a little bit more of an ability to manage our emotions. We maybe don't come unglued so easily. We maybe don't get angry so easily or sad so easily. We learn to manage those things. We learn that a 15-year-old can burst into tears because something bad happens at school, but a 22-year-old typically doesn't do that. And so we begin to do that a little bit better as young adults. Third thing that happens, we begin to move through autonomy toward interdependence. Now, this is kind of like what Sharon Parks said, that when she said we kind of move from being dependent to interdependence toward interdependence, depending on other people. And Chickering said that happens in young adulthood. It's also related to the idea that in young adulthood, and this is Erickson's idea, that we establish our primary intimate relationships in young adulthood, which means that we become interdependent. We begin to build our own families or think about building our own families, which requires some level of interdependence. We also do that with friends and roommates and other people that we meet in the college experience. Fourth vector for Chickering is that we begin to develop more mature interpersonal relationships. Again, we can have a level of intimacy as young adults that we really don't have at our disposal when we're teenagers. Teenagers really can't do that very well. But a 22-year-old is much better at it. So in moving through college, we move toward more adult-like interpersonal relationships that are built on interdependence and intimacy and very often more authenticity between people. The fifth thing is we in college begin to establish an identity. We work on that through adolescence, but as you know, and we got this from Arnett also, that we spend a long time working on identity now in our culture. And Chickering was identifying this even in the 80s, that even in college, we're still working on identity, and most of us can go back to our college years and say, well, yeah, absolutely, that's what I was doing. Some of you are doing that right now. You're still working on identity and kind of trying to nail down what that is. And that's very normal and very typical in college. The sixth thing from Chickering is that he said we begin to develop some sense of purpose. Now again, this is related to choosing a career, choosing a college major, figuring out what we're competent in. All of those kinds of things, establishing identity, may lead us to some sense of having purpose. Why am I here? Why did I come to this place? Why am I like I am? Why do I have these gifts and not these other gifts? What's my purpose? This is also very much related to spiritual development, spiritual growth, and faith development in young adults. Figuring out, why am I here? Not why are we all here so much, but why am I here? And lastly, Chickering says we begin to develop some level of integrity. Adolescents are not known for their integrity because they're changing all the time. One day they believe one thing, the next day they believe something else. They like you and then they don't like you. They change friends, they change girlfriends and boyfriends, they change social groups. Not a ton of integrity in adolescence. Although, of course, that varies from kid to kid. But as young adults, we begin to be in places and relationships and situations that really require us to have more integrity, to live in more of a way that the way we behave reflects what we believe. And that becomes more consistent within us. Not totally, of course, and we're always shifting. But young adulthood, there seems to be more of a level of integrity than we've had as teenagers. So there are Chickering's vectors. Now, I want us to think about some kind of basic traditional things that happen to young adults. Individual factors, and then in a minute some other kinds of ideas and factors. If we look at traditional expectations, we tend to have two distinct traditional expectations for men and women. For men, it's the achievement of autonomy, that men will go out and become their own person and become independent and become productive and not depend on other people. Be autonomous. Move out of your parents' home. Get away from your mom and dad. Be your own man. All of that kind of very traditional Western stuff. Developing a sense of autonomy. Historically, women have been taught that their goal in becoming an adult is to continue attachment, but attachment in a different way. To detach from your parents and attach yourself to a man. Usually in the form of a marriage. Now, these are very traditional and very stereotypical even, so I'm not promoting that this is what we're supposed to do. But what we're saying here is that this is what historically has been what kind of determined if you were becoming an adult or not. If you were a young man, it was, are you independent? If you were a young woman, it was, are you married? And some of you, even now in 2013, can probably report that you've felt those exact pressures because of your gender. And that may be really unfortunate, but sometimes that's still the way it is. So we also tend to look at the idea of independence. Some of you in your responses and your review of the Arnett book talked about your own experiences there, being financially independent or dependent, being geographically independent. Some of you are geographically very much removed from your family, but you're still financially dependent to a certain extent. So there's a lot of different levels of independence, but we tend to think as young adults, if we are going to be adults, there's some level of independence that's there that wasn't there when we were teenagers. Next thing on this slide, a cultural balance of challenge and support. As young adults, we tend to need both of those. I mean, we need both of those all through our lives. But there's a little bit of a shift here. And it's one of the things that makes being a college professor or running a university from an administrative standpoint kind of tricky, because young adults need a healthy balance of challenge and support. More challenge than we had when we were adolescents, but still some need for support. So when an 18-year-old goes to college, do we treat them like a kid or do we treat them like an adult? That's always something we're trying to figure out and do better. But that's something that shifts in young adulthood. Opportunities for exploration have always been a part of becoming an adult. We do some of that in adolescence, but you know that if you live in your parents' house and you don't have any money and you're not very independent, that your exploration is somewhat limited. Young adulthood usually brings lots more opportunities for exploration. You can go where you want to go, you can do what you want to do, you can be who you want to be with. If you live independently, or even if you're just geographically separated from your family, you have more opportunity to explore new options. And then the last thing there is almost kind of trite to say, but one of the things that we tend to want is we all have some kind of an idea of what it means for us to create an adult life. And that means different things. And again, we talked about that in the Arnett book some, and in your responses. How do I become an adult? What does it mean to me to feel like I'm an adult? And that varies from person to person. Okay? Be right back.